Good afternoon. Todd Profit again here from the State University of New York at Fredonia. This is again another video for Lighting Design 1. We just did one on dance lighting, and now I want to do one on lighting musicals and opera. And the reason why I'm talking about them together is they're very similar. There's some slight variances between the two. One of the biggest differences is, I think, in opera. It tends to be a little grander, tends to be a little more spectacle involved because typically the sets are big, the casts are big, particularly when you're doing grand opera. It's one of the biggest differences between the two. Also, the other big difference is if the chorus is on stage, you're not always necessarily required to light them the same as you're lighting the principals. The principals being the main characters in the opera. It was best described to me once as oftentimes the chorus is just moving and singing scenery, and you light them appropriately. But where you can get away with that a little more in opera than you maybe can in a musical. If everyone's out there singing, then typically you want to have them all lit. So let's talk about, I want to start this time, last time I started with cues, this time I want to start with the systems. The systems for lighting an opera musical are very similar to those in lighting a straight play. The biggest difference is you need more options. You're going to have a lot more light cues, possibly, or the cues are going to be based off of music or movement. So you've got to have some options that are maybe a little less realistic than you would do in maybe a straight play that was just set, very realistic. So you've got to give yourself more options in the plot, so you can change things as you start to develop and start to write your cues. So let's talk about the couple different approaches. Honestly, it's just like the plays. You can either go with a McCandless 3-point or a jewel tone. I have actually done musicals where I've combined the two, where essentially I would take the front lights here and put them in over here, and everything else would be the same. And what that will allow me to do is sometimes to use a high side light and then a 45-degree front light together, where I normally wouldn't have that option or the need to do that in a play. The challenge with that is how many instruments it's going to take. You're going to double your instruments for a play, and that's where a lot of times musicals will be a little heavier light plot. But again, the key is to give yourself lots and lots of options. Now, this is all talking about conventional instruments. What I might do sometimes is interchange one of these systems that you see with moving light. So maybe that backlight wash could be one of these backlight washes. Could be a moving light that could not only move, but it could add texture and it could change color. Or realistically, what we're starting to see more and more is these are going to be LEDs for your backlight. It's going to give you lots of options, lots of color, and really make it so that every song, every scene is just a little different, and so it doesn't all look the same. One of the big things that we're going to add over plays is we will add sometimes boom lights in. Now, the booms are always going to depend on the scenery. If there's scenery moving off and on in the wings, then booms are just not going to be a possibility. We cheat sometimes at Fredonia and use the side pipes for kind of a boom light down lower. That way, if scenery needs to move in and out, those can move up and down. This is the dance setup. I realized I forgot to do one thing. Typically, what you don't see in musicals and operas are the shin busters. It really is more of a dance thing, but you are going to see the mids and the head highs for those. All right, so that's the basic idea. That's the basic sort of way you're going to do lighting keys. Let's talk next about cues. Okay, cues are going to be very similar. Again, to plays in the beginning of scenes, ends of scenes. But then once you get into a song, typically because that's a major change, you're going to want to change the lighting for that in some way, shape, or form. Oftentimes for me, it's more realistic in the scenes and I'll bring out more color. That's when I'll start to bring in my booms. That's when I'll start to bring in my backlight. Oftentimes what I might do is bring everything down and turn on a follow spot. That was the one thing I forgot to show you on here, is we typically do add follow spots for principals. How many? That always depends. One is typical, sometimes 2, maybe 3. Just depends on what you're going for the show, and also what your crew's, what the availability of your crew is. Oftentimes at Toy, where I would want to use a follow spot, I don't, just because we don't have the crew available to do it. if I need a follow spot or I think a show needs a follow spot, I have to make sure I make that request at the very first meeting, if not before, because I need to make sure that they can put that into the budget. Okay, so back to the cue list. So you're going to start, all right, and then typically once you get going, you're going to, like I said, make a change for a song. Well, once you hit that song change, what's going to control the internal cues? Sometimes it's going to be as simple as we change from the verse to a chorus. A lot of people like to make sort of that change. Sometimes it's change in movement, where they move upstage, they move downstage, and sometimes it's just so it's usually those two big things. Just like dance, changes in the music, changes in the movement are good reasons to make changes in the middle of a song for a musical. And then once you get down to the end of the song, not always, sometimes it might just be a simple fade out. I like to do, depending on the musical, but I like to do like a button at the end of the song. This was for Pete the Cat. You know, this is a bump. Basically, it probably Bump Rider, knowing that show. And then once you get out of that, you got to give the audience time to clap. And then once the sort of clap recedes, then you go back into whatever sort of like cue you were in before, or whatever, go back into the normal scene. Okay. Oftentimes with musicals too, you're going to deal, because there's lots of scene changes, you're going to deal with transitions. So you might have to establish a transition light. When you establish a transition light, just be consistent. Don't go dark on some, light on some. Come up with a way that you can make it be seamless sort of throughout the whole thing. Sometimes it's just going to a blue light so that there's enough room for people to see on stage and the audience can see it a little bit. I love the Auvista up at Toy. We do Auvista means in front of the audience. We love doing scene changes in front of the audience, sometimes with the actors. What I'll do oftentimes is I have box boom positions that I will put textured washes in, so I can put the textured washes coming across stage, and it's a great way to represent scene changes or transitions. So that's some of the big basics. And again, that's true for opera as well. Again, you're going to make those changes. I think you're going to tend to use your follow spots more in those cues. You're going to tend to really focus down on that aria, because the aria or the solo that someone's doing, they're just extremely dramatic. So you want to heighten that with lighting. Okay. Let's just show you just some quick combinations on Virtual Light Lab. Again, coming in here, this is just with McCandless and a straight backlight. Again, we might, that does have a boom in it. Okay, take the boom out, but maybe for the song, we add in some boom light just to kind of deepen it and make it a little richer. Take those out when we go back to the normal scene light, and then it might have a backlight color when we go to that. We'll go back to our normal scene light. Again, the psych is going to be your best friend. Pardon me while I grab the set colors here. So again, we can, if I turn, we want a really dramatic red psych or a dramatic blue psych. Once again, you got to be careful with psychs. You got to be, and this is where I really want the scene designers to look at this. See how small that makes the human feel. You got to be careful, particularly modern musicals. They're much more intimate than some of those big musicals are. So when you're designing not only your psychs, but your drops, and you're masking for those psychs and you're masking for those drops, the bigger you make it, the tinier you're going to make those people feel. So if it's a musical or an opera that's very intimate, then you don't want that big space behind them. Okay, let's just look at some different musical pictures. This is one, I believe, from Wicked. One of the things that I forgot to mention for dance too, haze is an amazing thing for dance and opera and musicals. Haze, you can it really makes it more dramatic. You can see a lot of the beams. There's probably a whole bunch of moving lights in this. We're more and more seeing moving lights enter lighting design. And essentially what they're doing is, in many ways, the way I use them is I use them for some for specials, and some for they'll replace a system of lights. So that might be my system of backlight, like I said earlier, or I might use them because I'm going to use them for my template wash. But then when I need them as a special, I can turn them around and make them my special. Why are we still learning conventional lights then? Well, the answer is the places you're going to go when you start, they're not going to have a lot of moving lights. You're going to be lucky if they have 1 or 2 LEDs. So here's a picture, I believe, Hamilton, and I'm not sure what this one is. Okay, but again, very colorful, very dramatic. the haze, obviously. Now, obviously, the search that I'm doing for was pretty straightforward. But actually, even if we go back to here, this is a fairly realistic scene. But they're just heightened a little more in color. They're just, because, let's face it, you don't go along and just all of a sudden start humming the lighting. So you're going to make it, you're going to make it just a little more dramatic, a little more colorful than you normally would. That's just pictures of lights themselves. Probably, Chicago, definitely Chicago. Okay. All right, so let's talk about opera lighting. And again, with opera, you're gonna look. It's a lot of the same things, even maybe a little more dramatic. If you get a chance, I know the Met's showing a lot of their operas right now. So if you get a chance, look at some of those. But again, cueing is very similar, except maybe a little more dramatic than normal. The one big thing I want to talk about cues for opera is, instead of calling them by a certain time in the music, time and place, oftentimes for those lighting designers who read music, and actually if you've got a good stage manager who reads music, they can help you with this. They'll call the musics on the measures as opposed to on the as opposed to a specific place in the script or a certain word. I worked with my very first stage manager that I worked with as a professional was at the Des Moines Opera, and she would call it on the music, and she would call it the same every single time, and it was so amazing because you would sit there, you would get into a rhythm. It'd be stand by like Q2, go, and it was the same every time because the music was same every time. Is it essential that you know how to read music? It definitely helps if you know how to read music, whether you're doing an opera or a musical. But it's not 100% necessary. Some of it's going to depend on the company, whether they want you to do that or not. All right. So that's everything I want to talk about for lighting musicals and opera.